All right, we're all here. Welcome everyone to our last session of the day. We've had 3 wonderful sessions before this, but I'd also like to say welcome to everyone who has joined us only just now, because I know for some people it is very early. You can, yeah. Sorry, something happened in my screen. No, 1 second. This is the very first technical problem we had to deal with for today, so it's a good thing, I guess. Welcome to our session about hands-on the digital, the most difficult session to name, so that's why it's so vague. But I think actually the videos that we've been seeing and the people that we're speaking with today are a very good fit to one another, and I'm very much looking forward to where this discussion is going to go. So I will just introduce myself for everyone who's kind of joining us just now. My name is Suzette. I work here as a postdoc and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm sitting here in the room with Christina Lechtermann. She is professor of German literature and the early and high Middle Ages here at the Ruhr-Universität. And she is the project leader of the project Virtual Text, Handwritten Books, the making of text as knowledge in literary studies here at the Collaborative Research Center Virtuele Lebenswelten, that our project Virtual Middle Ages is also part of. And this project looks specifically at courtly literature from 13th and 14th century, and they are making a critical edition, online edition of 2 manuscripts. The video that we watched of Christina was focused on a little booklet. It's called the Roos Buchlein, if I'm correct, by Sebald Beam. The video was focused, or Christina spoke about interesting ideas about movement and experience within the manuscript, but also the digital object. On the screen here with us is Dot Porter. Dot Porter is curator of digital research services at the Kislak Center for Special Collections and the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies. This is located in Philadelphia, in the US. And she is an expert in the digitization of manuscripts and digital services, and also the leader of the Viscol project. She has set the Viscol project up together with Alberto Campagnolo, who we saw in the last session, and we've already discussed Viscol quite a bit, and it might actually come up today as well. And the video in her video she talked about an exhibition on the movement of books and considering how we can show movement of books in different ways, different formats. We are also joined by Astrid Smith. She is rare books and special collection. She is a rare books and special collections digitization specialist at Stanford University Libraries, also in the US. She is a manager of digitization projects with a background in heritage photography, and I'm guessing you're also still doing quite a lot of photography in your daily life. Yeah. And she, in her video, she spoke about the Memo project and the trials and tribulations of digitizing bundled medieval documents. And the last person we're joined with here today is Bridget Whearty. She is Associate Professor of English Literature and Medieval Studies. And I did not write down the university, but it's Bingham University or Bingham, right?
Binghamton.
Yes, okay, sorry.
It's okay.
She has done a lot of work in thinking about the digitization of medieval manuscripts, and if I am correct, but people can correct me if I'm wrong, she is the coiner of the term digital codicology. And at the moment she works a lot with LGBTQIA plus medieval material and literature. And in the video this also was the main topic in which she spoke about the project Always Here. This is a digital source book for LGBTQIA literature and digital manuscripts. So those are our speakers. Very happy to have you here. And I'd like to kick off with taking a leaf out of Dot Porter's book from her podcast, Inside My Favorite Manuscript. And I'll start by asking Christina, but I would love to hear from you all. What is your favorite object or manuscript that you're working with now, digital or physical?
Yeah, actually the manuscript that puzzled me most, at least at the moment, are something like have some similar effects to the book that I talked about in the video. Insofar as they are making use of the writing material, of the mise en page, or of the book's existence as three-dimensional object to offer dimensions of meaning which is not captured in the text alone or in the images alone. And well, the little video is on a booklet on geometry, which is a bit of my hobby horse, but our project, Christopher and mine, actually is on text that describe the life of the Virgin Mary, often in a very allegorical way, and they do something quite similar. For instance, mixing the appearance of the text, making the text appear on the page, switching from black ink to red ink and back again in about 10 lines, and intervening the narrative part of the Virgin's life with quotations, for example. Or another example we are looking at is a paper manuscript that inserts only one sheet of vellum at a certain space. And if you look at the vellum, you think, oh, why is it there? Because there is a very scratchy sketch on it. You can hardly see it. It's supposed to have become an image once, but somebody broke up the project or something like that. And if you turn the pages in that manuscript, you recognize that this vellum might be there because a few pages later Mary is described as vellum, which so basically I'm into manuscript that do something with the material, some material semantics, if you want, like this. Yeah.
Very interesting.
And of course the question, how do you bring this in a meta data description and on the internet?
Yeah, definitely.
In the end.
Yeah. Who would like to follow this?
I can go next. So I think about this a lot because, as you said, this is a question I'd like to ask people. So the manuscript that I like it both working with it in the reading room, both physically, and also it's interesting thinking about digital methods. The shelf mark is LJS 101, and it's a Carolingian manuscript, partially written in the mid-9th century, and part of it was replaced in the early 11th century. So that in and of itself is interesting historically. The part that is the earlier part is a translation. It's a copy of a translation by Boethius of Aristotle's text De Institutione, I think is the name of the text. But it's sort of early, and then there's a copy of it in the 8th century. ninth century. And what it appears is that in the early 11th century, there was somebody or some group of people said, well, we want to have a new manuscript that includes this text, but instead of writing a whole new copy, we have this copy that was, maybe it was damaged. It's sort of hard to say because, only part of it survives. And so what they did is they wrote something at the beginning, which is now missing. We know that it's partially missing because there's sort of an incomplete text at the very beginning of the manuscript that we have now. And then we have this Boethius text that starts about 4 leaves in and continues on, and then it switches back to, or switches to like 11th century replacement, like another choir at the end, which includes other texts, which I think are part of the quadrivium or the trivium, maybe. Like it sort of is clear that it was sort of part of this Carolingian educational program, right? So it was a manuscript written for a specific thing. And then the 9th century section, actually the same scribe who wrote the 11th century parts went through and made a lot of corrections. So there's a whole lot of like interlinear glosses and collections and things. And there's also clearly probably 3 choirs of the 9th century text missing as well. So there's like a whole big chunk of text that's not even there. And so that's like, as a historical object, it's fascinating. But then thinking about digitizing it, on one hand, okay, well, what we can do is we can digitize it the way we digitize any manuscript and sort of photograph it and, put the leaves in order. We can make a Viscall model of it, which we've done. But because of all of the work that was sort of done to it, you can also think about, well, how can we model sort of previous versions of it? How can we sort of show what's missing at the beginning, what's missing in the middle? There also, I didn't mention this, but parts of the beginning and end have also been misbound. So they're actually out of order in the book. So what was originally, let's say, a 12-leaf choir is now an 8-leaf choir and a 4-leaf choir, sort of side by side, when it should have been in the middle. So this is one I love to look at it, and I love to think about it, and that's really my favorite one.
All right, thank you. So, Bridget, can you?
Sure. So for a long time, I was obsessed with like 1 or 2 manuscripts that I was using for the case studies in my book that came out in November of last year. But now I'm kind of surfing through various digital manuscripts, depending on what case study I'm working on for my big queer and trans digital project. Right now, it's Bibliothèque Nationale, Latin manuscript 10318, which is the late 7th, early 8th century manuscript of 6th century Latin poetry from North Africa, that I talk about a little bit in my video, including discovering that one of the poems that is in it has never been published with the right first word, because of annotations in the margins sort of taking over. I don't know how many people are available in the chat, but I'm just going to throw in the link to the manuscript, because it's really exciting to have so many paleographers in the physical and digital space, because I am not actually a paleographer. So if anybody wants to weigh in with me, especially on the little monstrum written in the inner margin by the very large, very clear early 8th century nostrum, I would love to talk about it with you, because that's the hand that's responsible for this poem never being printed with the right first word.
Yeah, that was a very something that really struck out in your video as well. I think it's just such a good example. Astrid.
All right. Well, let's see. I will throw a link in the chat too. So I fall in love with every object that comes through the lab. Maybe not every single object, but I feel like that's kind of part of my job is when I'm holding it, I'm in love with it, and I'm going to show it to you as best I can. But this one was really surprising to me. It's a textual amulet containing a set of nomina magica. Of course, I had to look it up, and the project that it came to me through is one where the objects there's only a title. There's no metadata at the time of digitization. So that's happening afterwards. So I'm only able to kind of get as much as I just told you about the object. So of course, I'm fascinated. I'm seeing these lines of concentric circles of text and magical symbols. I know the object is not as old as it looks like it should be. It looks like it's hearkening back to a much older object. Somebody's trying very carefully to write neatly and reference the kind of beautiful scribal work, but maybe not. This is not their day job. They're kind of doing as best they can because they're trying to, what I later learned is maybe affect the weather, or they have some purpose that this object is serving. It's not just trying to be beautiful. But I thought it was really interesting that I perform a step in the workflow that is we call it final QA, where I look at my staff's work after they have done the post-production, like cropping and rotation. And when I saw this, my staff member, John Pearson, put the object, it's more like a diamond. It's not square like you would think when you look at a piece of paper or parchment, not square to the cropping window of the object. And I thought, you know what? Now that I'm looking at the object, that makes way more sense. So great work, John. I agree with his decision to prioritize the text in the small circle of the object, and I hit pass in the workflow. So it went on its way online for you to view.
Amazing. I can see that a lot of the links to these objects have also been dropped in the chat. Unfortunately, not the best way to show it to the audience here, but in this sense, the Zoom audience has one step ahead and can have a look at them. I think it's really interesting to hear you all talk about these objects, and this is possibly also why you all fit so well in this session. It's because I think we're all thinking about this idea of materiality and how to deal with these manuscripts in different ways. So just to open with a very general question about this idea of hands-on the digital. So can you all elaborate? I'm just throwing it out there. What does hands-on or maybe even haptics mean in your work? And how can this quality of hands-onness, that's what I wrote down, be translated to a digital format? I mean, maybe Dot, you can maybe start with this because I think you also went into these different types of formats. I love the idea of a video facsimile, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, we all know. I think, a few years ago, I think if you said the digital is not like the physical, people were sort of like, wow, this is a new thing. But now it's sort of old news. Like we all know that. But now we can start really thinking about how it's different and how or if, there are digital methods for getting to, different parts of what it is like to be with a manuscript. And I think part of the reason I'm so fascinated this is because of my background, because I actually started doing digital work. And I did digital work for 10 years before I came to Penn. And it was only when I came to Penn that I actually started, sitting down with manuscripts and realizing how different these objects are from how they tended to appear on the screen. And only in the past few years that I've really started doing a lot more with video. And it was actually starting to do the video that made me think more about this. And so I feel like I've lost track of what actually the question was. I'm so sorry.
Am I muted? Yeah, sorry. Sometimes we have to synchronize the muting, so that's why. The question was kind of what does hands-on mean in your work? Kind of this haptic quality. Yeah.
Right. So that was a good sort of intro. So the hands-on is then how can I present the materials in the collection because I am a curator, right? So I have this physical collection. And what I'm thinking about is how can I express to the people who are using this collection what it's like to be in a room with it, which is very different from saying, here you can read the text. So things like, a lot of the sort of paleography that we were talking about in the earlier sessions, that's not terribly relevant to what I'm doing. The work that, obviously that Alberto was talking about in the last session is a lot more relevant because he's thinking about structure. We work together on VisCall. We're both thinking about structure, and structure is sort of part of that, but it's still, the movement of it, the feeling of it under your hands and that kind of thing. Haptics is you use the term haptics, and that's a really good one, is probably impossible to get. But, I feel like the movement, now that I've started thinking about movement really because of this exhibit, I'm thinking about that a lot more and how to express that. And what I'm finding is that digital is not really a great way to do that. Like virtualization is not great. Video is really good. Thinking even more now about the facsimiles, like physical facsimiles, that's not even really digital, except if you have facsimiles that are like printed with digital images, you take the digital images, you print them out, you bind them together like it's the book. What is that? Now I'm thinking about like, what kind of thing is that? It's like a strange, almost like a physical thing made digital and then made physical again. So you can touch it. And even that is like different from having the book because the material is different, and we're printing it. I'm not going to print it on parchment. I might print it on fancy paper, but it's still not the same, So I don't know. So this is all the stuff that's in my head when I'm thinking about this and how it's not only digital, but digital is sort of a part of this much larger experience of the object. And I think there's not going to be any one answer. It's more like combining a lot of different things maybe together to get that. But it's fun to think about in a theoretical way.
Before I give the word to someone else who has anything to say about it, I'd like to interject a little bit because there's some work being done by Lise-Laure Thiesse, who has done some work in a museum with Vermeer's Girl with Pearl Earring, and she has done ethnographical work, and she concluded that the audience, like more general audience, was actually not that interested in digital facsimiles. They were much more interested in the 3D prints, for example. It's really interesting stuff. So this might also be something that we can use in the manuscript studies. I will send you the article. So does anyone else have anything to say about this, the haptic quality? Bridget, was that a hand? Yes, please.
Yes. So I feel like I had just such a fangirl moment watching Dot's video. I really loved it. And I loved this idea of digital manuscripts as part of a much larger ecosystem where things can move in and out of media formats in order to facilitate different kinds of experience and access. I feel like both of my projects sort of bookend that in different ways or exist sort of right outside of it. So the subtitle of my book is Medieval Books and Modern Labor. And for me in that, it was the question of sort of hands-on was really like whose hands have been on it in the making of it as a digital object, who's touched it, what was the workflow, how was it made. Astrid is actually kind of the star of chapter 1. And Dot shows up in chapter 3. So this is sort of like my table of contents here. I think with Always Here, I'm kind of going back to a much more elementary state. where hands-on kind of actually just means something more like eyes-on. I want to break the divide between manuscript studies and literary studies, because I want to show my literature and history students what these texts look like, especially queer and trans texts in the medieval period, in their manuscripts contexts, because they're so stunned that, like, oh, here are erotic love letters between nuns, and they're just in a book with a bunch of other letters. What do you mean? So I think that really basic access is really stunning. As a manuscript scholar, I do sort of hope that giving that basic level of eyes-on access will inspire those students to take advanced manuscript studies classes and get their hands on more of the hard copy manuscripts. But yeah, I think my work kind of exists outside of and in conversation with what Dot does and Astrid's.
Yeah.
Actually, since I got your invitation, I'm struggling with your subtitle, digital and virtual, and I was wondering if one could divide three kinds of hands-on, and the first one, of course, would be the interaction with the object itself, which is needed because otherwise you won't know what to talk about and come up with the right questions to describe the object. And the second one seems obviously to be the digital, and that's the skills in how to give a really proper description in the metadata and of the object and so on. And managing the editors is quite a task for us at this stage of our project. And of course, that's a hand-on experience as well. The third, I think, could be perhaps thought of if you really could turn the book into a virtual object, like I'm not sure we talked about today, an object which is more than just digitalized paper and more than just really nicely done metadata, and for example, not only leaf through it, but make the VR turn the pages back to the gathering and the gathering back to the leaves, so you sort of can deconstruct the book and show where the geometry is in the book. That would be a very new way of hands-on. I guess we should try this with the booklet as object of, what's it called, virtual object of the month or something like that.
Thanks.
Hi. So I think I've always been a primarily hands-on person in both this position and every position. I have a fine art background and have worked in studios, letterpress studios, and in conservation. And every day is hands-on, whether it's doing an assessment, the work that happens before the digitization, or doing digitization itself. But I think just to have kind of like a cheeky answer, recently I was working with an object that it's a seed peddler's book. It's really interesting, from the early 1900s, and it's a very long vertical object that opens vertically, and then it's folded like an accordion. So unfortunately, it's not online. I can't show you. You'll have to picture it. But it's just this huge, long object, maybe 6 feet, because you can imagine the peddler spreading it out in front of you. When you see a still image of this shot front and back, you don't have a sense of scale. You don't have a sense of how it operates, how it functions. So we don't have a video like Dot was providing, but I decided for the first time to go rogue and include a shot of my hands opening the object vertically. So you see, for the first time that has happened at Stanford, at least, I'm not sure if others are doing this, but my hands are in the shot because I felt like you really need to see how this works, how you open it, and how it functions. So there's my twofold answer to the hands-on question.
All right. Thank you all for the questions. There's a lot of things I'm thinking about, but there's also questions from the audience, so I'm going to give that priority. Sanne?
Yes, thank you all for your enlightened videos, because especially showing the handling of the manuscripts reminds us that they are actual things and not things that exist only in the virtual realm. I was wondering because, as I said earlier, I agree with the leafing through the manuscript. We're not able to demonstrate that naturally enough to make it more than a nice gig or gadget to show it. But there are other examples of how a virtual version of a manuscript can be very interesting. For example, with the RTI that was shown by Alberto shortly, where we can manipulate the light. And currently I'm very interested in, for example, how unstable lighting sources, so candles, for example, react with manuscripts. Because that was the way that they were seen, with candles or oil lamps, and not with very cool LED lighting of a museum exactly pointed to the best result. So, and I think that if I go to a curator and I say, can I borrow a manuscript? I will put 300 candles around it. I see the shock and horror on the face of Dot. It will not happen, but VR can give us the opportunity to experiment hands-on with manuscripts in a way that we cannot do. And we are currently, Lisadora, whose name was mentioned here, and I are doing that with a medieval panel painting. So again, no one will let us put 300 candles around a medieval panel painting, but in the virtual world, we can do that and simulate how it looks. I was wondering if you can reflect on that, if you see possibilities for that within your own projects.
I'll give the word first to Christina and then Dot, please.
Yeah, actually, even if you go to archive or museum or a library, you won't see, even if you go near the window, you won't see a light effect. I think your question becomes particularly vital if you think of things like metallic ink or special dyes, because we have looked at these recipes and actually the pictures will have looked something very different to any light we meet them in.
Dot.
Yeah, so that's a really great point. It makes me think of two things. One is that I actually have battery operated candles in the lab where I do my work. So I have actually, and I'm going to be meeting later this week with a student who's working on a project, and we're going to pull them out and make it very dark. So she's going to be doing this. So we are thinking about this. I'd love to be able to do something like this as part of my exhibit. I was thinking about this exact thing because you're right. The light situation is just so different. And the way that we think about lighting during digitization as like, you have to have the, it up here and this kind of thing. And so I think generally for digitization, thinking about different kinds of lighting is, I see Astrid as like making notes. I'm sure that this is something she thinks about too. But it's also something where, this is a really great example where like virtualization of some kind can be really helpful, especially if you have, the RTI or some other kind of like 3D models. I think in my video, I showed some work that Bill Endres has done where you have a light source that you can sort of move around. And that's, something that you really, Christina's right. Like you can't do this in the room, in the reading room. Like it's really hard to do unless you have a special place to do it. So I think that's a really great example. Thank you.
Astrid?
I love that question too. And yes, I'm filled with ideas and inspiration. I think that we have a lot of creative solutions and innovation and ideas in the lab that sometimes there's just no way to implement with the current image viewer technology. Like specifically for me, what we have online at Stanford, sometimes I'm like, I can't do what I want to do to show you the object. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't tell the developers what to do, but I will sometimes make notes. I'll talk to my team. I'll try to keep a record of here's what I would like to do for this, which we can't currently do. But I also think it's important to talk with other organizations like museums who have very different approaches to imaging objects, and find out if other people are doing things in a way that we could emulate and try to get closer to some of these other possibilities.
I would like to ask a question, and maybe in the same vein, but also in the same vein that what Christina was talking about. The title of our workshop, Middle Ages Digital and Virtual, implies the fact that the virtual is not the same as the digital, and this is also something that is very much discussed in our research center here and in our project as well. So kind of this idea of the virtual Middle Ages as something that is more than the digital object that we're talking about, but kind of more like the Middle Ages that through digitizing these objects we're creating and shaping a kind of new Middle Ages. Maybe we can reflect on this a little bit more. I'm thinking about it possibly from my own perspective in terms of individual objects, but also I think, Bridget, you're the perfect person possibly to come in here, because with these collections or this kind of collection of digital sources, you're also shaping a virtual collection of kind of new, I wouldn't say new, but knowledge about these medieval texts. Maybe Bridget, if you have any ideas about this.
I want to back up briefly to my brain was whirring with my panelist fellow panelist answers. In my work, I always feel torn between being that sort of unreasonable humanities dreamer of all that a thing could be, and then trying to think also pragmatically about like what can we actually afford to do. But one of the things that kind of talking about candlelight and different light sources got me thinking of is when I teach my students about books of hours and talking about people bringing prayer books to church. How lovely it would be to have some kind of virtual exhibit or option where we could be like, okay, and here's the kind of light. Here's how the colors of the book play with light coming through like a specific stained glass window. Because some of the light would be just sort of like daylight or candlelight, but some of it would be color inflected. And that was just suddenly very exciting in my head. I have no idea if that's possible. I think that might be humanities dreamer and not library practical. In terms of making, kind of the new digital Middle Ages, or sort of using digital materials and collections to look back at the medieval period differently. I'm thinking, I can't remember who said it in their video, and I don't want to pull up my notes while I'm talking, but someone in one of the earlier sessions made a wonderful point about how when we go to the virtual, we are picking and choosing. We are kind of constructing a Middle Ages in our expectations and in our own image, and to be wary of that. And I think the virtual collection that I'm trying to build is very self-consciously and from an activist perspective, constructing another access point to the Middle Ages in the for my community, which has been kind of systematically cut out of the stories we tell about the Middle Ages. Like, I've used textbooks to teach Introduction to Medieval and Renaissance Studies for almost 10 years now, and there's never trans representation in them. There is maybe one piece of queer representation, and it is always negative. And so I am incredibly grateful to the principles of mass digitization, because it allows me to go through and select and draw to the surface all of these texts and all of this evidence that I can then put in my students' hands and see what they'll do with it.
I like this idea of a conscious virtualization of the Middle Ages, I think, because I think it might be better than thinking you're creating or looking back at the Middle Ages that we know existed, because in a way it's always a virtual space. Sanne also said something, but because of the muting it's a little bit difficult, but you said that you're creating...
Well, we have a proposal within the Horizon European Collaborative Cloud call, which I advise you all to look up, because it's a lot of money for digitization of objects for grant consortium. So let's find one another as medievalists and push our objects to this collaborative cloud. But we have a proposal there for a new viewer where you can play with light, and in a way that you do it with the RTI, but with multiple possibilities, so in stable lighting and also with annotating the object, so the combination of different data of technical research. If we get it, it will be very cool.
Yeah,
but
that
you
is.
know how it goes with these kind of things.
Before I go on to any other questions, I would like to see if the speakers want to speak to what Bridget just said. Christina.
I guess that is an excellent argument, because even if you start using virtual reality more for didactic goals, or sort of you pick things to make them appear, I guess you start bringing topics that have been marginalized into teaching, and like your new project tries to do. And doing this, I mean, experience in German medieval literature shows whenever there is a text appearing newly in a translation or a new edition, my colleagues start research, because you need this sort of synergy effect. What's that in English?
Synergy, yes.
Synergy, yeah. You need the synergy, because you're teaching quite a lot in Germany. Actually, research is more easily done on topics which you can explore together with your students, and therefore this is a huge impact, I guess.
So there's a question from the audience.
Yes, Molly P. asked, has written, I have a question for Bridget. I think a database focusing on gathering together medieval evidence for non-hetero displays of love, affection, or gender identities other than cis examples is well overdue, and I support your mission to provide access in a world that increasingly seeks to deny their existence. My question is, how do you reckon with using terms first coined in the Victorian period and even more recently to describe medieval relationships and gender identities? These terms are products of their times and full of negative connotations, unconscious biases, and period-specific ideas that the medieval people whose documents we are looking at may never have seen as being applicable to their own experiences. As a member of the LGBTQA+ community, while an eager, we don't flatten, misrepresent our understanding of these documents with modern ideas about gender and sexuality, when it is likely that these medieval relationships and identities were conceived of in totally different ways by contemporaries.
Did you get that? Okay, great.
I love that question. And it's something that we're really wrestling with right now as we think about our indexing terms in particular, because absolutely, like to use, biased, frequently medically pathologizing terms that were invented by people outside the community goes against good practices in metadata, especially those that are being championed by the Trans Metadata Collective, Homosaurus, all of these kind of reparative cataloging moves. At the same time, I have to make things discoverable, right? And this is a project that is thinking primarily, or first at least, about students, undergraduate students especially, and even, this is such a bad term, but it's what I use in my head, normal people, so not academic researchers. So what we're dealing with right now, first of all, so thinking about metadata as tagging, and not having to do kind of one definitive label, I think is really important. So a character who is described as a eunuch in the text gets that as a label or a metadata tag, even if I don't think my 18-year-old student would ever use it. One of the issues that's kind of the other side of your question that I'd actually love to hear your input on, either here or over email later, is, do we do our end users a disservice by labeling something or someone as trans when the text itself is engaged in kind of pathologizing work? So in Eid and Olive, Eid first dresses as a man because their father wants to marry them and rape them. So they run away. And there's amazing literary work that is done analyzing this as like a trans medieval knight. But you tell that to somebody who works on contemporary trans philosophy, and they are appalled at the idea of this like violence, external motivation being labeled as trans. So it's kind of the opposite of your question, but I think it's like the ethics of the metadata choices are enormous for a project like this, both because we need to actually keep the promises we make to our users, and because there is the possibility of the use of our data by people who are against our community. Like, I don't want to make a resource that TERFs can then use to like grab the data and say, like, see, everything that we say bad about trans people today was true in the 13th century. So I'm very troubled by it, and it's kind of I think the right kind of thing to be troubled about. But like, please, I want to talk with you more. Please email me or talk with me more on Zoom or something.
First a question nog by Lena and then Sanne.
So it's also to you, Bridget. I think it's on the same way. It's about the alterity, right? That's the right word for this, which is many times also connected to the Middle Ages. So do you see this as a chance, or also maybe as a danger for your community? Like people saying, okay, that's Middle Ages, so there were so many, the dark Middle Ages, and so many stupid things happened there, and yeah. So how do you deal with this?
So I do think that we're running an interesting risk in kind of the balancing act between making claims about some essential universal human gender sexuality thing that we all know isn't true. But a version of is nevertheless really necessary, especially for beginners, especially for 18, 19-year-olds who are just beginning to try to find their way. I think one way of approaching the alterity issue and making sure we foreground it is to we don't just put the texts up, but to give them kind of that introductory information to help our end users still see that difference, to not see that kind of flattening out. And I think another kind of useful way to foreground the diversity of it, kind of going back to the metadata issue, is wherever possible, like in languages and communities that have their own terminology to use that terminology. So Sahar Amr has done amazing work on all of the different terms for lesbian that show up in Arabic. And there's also sort of terms in Hebrew that show up. And to be able to kind of use those tags on those texts, I think helps foreground the texts speaking for themselves and the difference between the texts. I don't know, I have a question back for you and the previous person who asked me a question, which is, do you think we should use like medieval Arabic and Hebrew language tags about sort of lesbian acts on Latin language texts? Like, should we import medieval gender sexuality terms from non-mainstream Christian European languages to tag those texts? Or is that just like a wacky step too far?
Lena, do you have an answer?
I give it to the audience.
I'm thinking that is that very different to tagging things in kind of modern terms? That, I mean, I don't have an answer to this, but it's just maybe a thing to think about. Dot, did I see your hand rise? Or?
So I'm thinking a lot of thoughts as Bridget has been answering. People have been asking Bridget questions, and she's been answering questions. And it's what I'm thinking about is this question of how medieval people thought of themselves and the things that they had, and how we see them and think about them, and how they're two different things. And we all know that, but maybe, again, I feel like I keep pointing out obvious things, but like maybe it's worth sort of talking about this a little bit, because on one hand, we want to look at, these physical objects, manuscripts, and think about how did medieval people see them? How did they read under sunlight, coming in the window or by candlelight? And how can we use technology to do that? But then on the other hand, there's, I also want to study the object in a different kind of way, in a way that a medieval person probably wouldn't. Like because when I look at, for example, LJS 101, which I mentioned very early on, this manuscript that was sort of constructed out of pieces, the people who did that were doing something very specific with it. They were trying to make a book that they could use probably for an educational purpose. I'm not going to use that book to teach people. I'm going to study that book to figure out how they thought about putting it together. And maybe another scholar who is interested in the educational thing will maybe look at it and say, okay, here's how it was actually used in a classroom, for example. And the kind of work that I'm going to do, I'm not going to do that by looking at it under candlelight. I'm going to do it by building a collation model and, restructuring it and reorganizing it and figuring out what was missing. And maybe that'll also tell me the story of what happened over time. And so it's not the same as saying how do, the question that Bridget is working with is like, what terminology do we use? But I feel like it's related, because it's like, how do we go from here is this object that was used in a specific way in its time, and here's us, and how do we maybe it's just about being really thoughtful about how we get from one place to another, and know when we're doing one thing and when we're doing another thing. That's what I'm thinking.
Thank you. This is also why we're here, just to have this reflection on what we're doing and why. I'm just going to go to Sanna's question.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I have a very short practical tip, because if you want to talk with your students about contested words, I can advise that publication Words Matter. It's from the Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands, and they've made a short PDF with complex terms where they discuss how do you use these complex terms, do you use them, is it appropriate or not, and I find it very useful for students who are entering this and are very afraid to do things wrong. So it's free on the internet. If you want to use it, then you can just download. There's an English version of it. You can just download it and see what's in there for you.
Great. Thank you. Perhaps it's a good time to kind of circle back to these ideas we talked about, hands-onness, and maybe we can think a little bit about experience and performativity, especially in Christina's video. We had a lot. Or you discussed the performance, or the book as a performance. As a kind of different type of movement, but these ideas of experience of digital objects in many forms kind of comes through in all of your videos. So maybe I'd be interested if you could reflect on the object as or collection in Bridget's case as a performance in itself, and consider the concept of experience. I know it's a very big question, but does anyone want to say something to that? Astrid?
I can kick it off. It will just be an intro for others to build on, but I think because of the nature of my work that my interactions with the objects are very performative. The instant of the camera's capture is just the tiniest piece of what I'm actually doing. The act of digitization is a huge, long performance, if you will, and then you're just getting this one tiny extracted moment from that in the digital aspect. But I also think a lot about objects that require further interaction. There's a tradition of the Amicorum passing around a book for others to sign, becoming a kind of conglomerate object. And I was digitizing one of them once where there was a paper puzzle cut into the page, and I worked with the head of conservation. We were each holding on to a transparent kind of ribbon type thing to lift it in a synchronized manner in order to get an image of what was inside the puzzle. And it was actually a lock of hair with a little poem. A fascinating object. And this is one where the whole act of the digitization was a performance. This unveiling of the hidden message in the puzzle was a performance, and then demonstrating this additional act in the digital object became a very a challenging kind of performance as well. So it's multi-layered. Maybe we can circle back to me again afterward. I'll just throw it to someone else after that.
Dot.
Yeah, so this is making me think about the work I do with video, because there's also this very much a performative thing, whether I have a live audience with me or not. And it's funny, Astrid, you were sort of talking about like this, and it's like, here's this one portion, and I'm like, oh, I do that too, but I record the whole thing. So you have like the whole thing. But it's making me think of one in particular that I did. I think it was back in June. I did a coffee with the Codex, which is like a 30-minute long thing, so quite a long performance. But it was featuring these manuscripts that I had never looked at before, called Scrolls of Esther. And if there are any Jewish people listening, then you're going to know what these are. The Scrolls of Esther, it's a document that is read out loud in a performance during the holiday of Purim. And it's the story of it's the book of Esther from the Bible. And it tells the story of Esther, who married, I'm going to get it all wrong, but she married the king, and one of the king's advisors wanted to kill all of the Jewish people. And she she, with the help of her cousin, ends up sort of turning it all around, and yay, the Jewish people survived, and it's great. It's a great celebration amongst the community, and because it's read out loud, there are these big, sort of relatively big. Some of them are bigger. I showed 3 of them, and it was clear from the way that they sort of work that they were made to be read out loud. I'd never seen so I've worked with rolls before, but these scrolls, they go side to side, and each section of text, it's folded on the sides of it. Which at first I was like, what's going on here? And then I realized that if you let go of the handles, because they're on these wooden handles, if you let go of the handles, they roll in and the folds make them stop. So if you're performing it, you can actually roll and you don't have to hold it open the way that you often do, which is good because it's pretty long. And so I'm thinking about the layers of performance that the manuscript, you could think even of like the creation of the manuscript as a performance, the people who are writing the text, and the context in which this would have been done. And then the people who would have used these manuscripts, and the performance of that during this sort of very celebratory, Purim is not like, it's not like Mass. This is like a big party and people get drunk, and it's from what I've heard, it's just like the biggest celebration of the year. And then there's me trying to figure this out. I don't read Hebrew, and I've never been to a Purim celebration, and just this whole thing was sort of it's like the layers of that. And that's what I was thinking about when you asked that question.
Yeah, definitely. And then also, of course, the layer of performance in the digitization, as Astrid tells, and then the performance of using the digital object as well. Maybe, Christina, do you have anything? You were talking a lot about the performance of moving through the book, but I'm also wondering if you can think about maybe the performance of using the digital object, or if you don't think that might be...
Sure, because actually I wanted to agree with Dot, because I think the praxeological dimension of how the book is made is crucial to understand it as an object. But of course there are performances if you deal with a mere digitalization, because the first thing I always do is usually insert an additional page, so the double pages will match, and not showing the recto and versa side on the screen, but because that's just is appalling if you don't. And then is you take the next step for me is you take a
Sorry? I don't know. I'm sorry. A circle? Just a circle? Oh.
Compasses, yeah. You take compasses and you take the small ration matching thing from the beginning and measure if it isn't already in the metatext, which it quite often isn't, or it's very inaccurate, only telling you this is a folio or quarto or small quarto, whatever that means, and trying to figure out how much centimeters is exactly what you're seeing there. So there is, for me as literary theory person, there is a performance dealing with the digital object I've been kindly given by a library.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then there, of course, is a sort of cultural study perspective that thinks of sense as processed by material and books and emerging like a event of meaning, which is
And is time for one more thought?
Yeah, please.
Just adding that another performance, I haven't thought of it this way, but I like that idea, that comes to mind is choosing the sequence of files for how we decide to show an object to you. If there's an enclosure, do we show the enclosure first? If there's other things stuck in, do we show those files in sequence where they fall in the object? There's a lot of choices about how this digital object is going to perform for the user. And I recognize how important it is for me to be very conscious of the choices that I'm making in that aspect.
Bridget, yes.
I have lots of thoughts. I do want to take one quick moment to say, Christine, I loved the point you made in your video about how the hard copy book performs differently than the digital, being able to kind of turn the pages and see the show through. And like, I think that that's just such a good example of the ways that these two different objects enhance each other, but how they are so profoundly different. And I couldn't let the conference pass without getting to tell you how much I loved that. Suzette, your question made me kind of go very literal immediately and think about the ways that in different states in the United States right now, public kind of playing with gender in performances is being outlawed. Like, no drag story hours, or, places where some child might see you. And I hadn't thought of the project like this in quite these terms, but I do think it is a kind of it will be a kind of public performance of care, kind of caring for the past, caring for these parts of the past that have been neglected, have been distorted, have been hidden. But that act of care is also sort of a very deliberate act of care for the present and the future. Kind of more broadly thinking about performance, this is where I confess that I want this project to hook these texts into the ecosystem that Dot is thinking about, because I know a database isn't going to change the world, but really good art can. So I think about at the end of chapter 3, where I was interviewing Dot about bibliophilia, I asked her, what's the thing you want people to do with the manuscripts that this giant digitization project is making? And she said, the thing I can't think of, the thing that wouldn't occur to me to make. And so I think about this data set that I'm making, and I want to know what performances people will make out of it. I really want a composer to fall in love with the nuns' love letters and put them to music. I told someone that this weekend, and she was like, "Ooh, it would be a great ballet." That's what I dream of. Is that these being kind of the raw fuel for new kinds of very public play and performance with these overlooked texts and this kind of invisible history.
Thank you. I also really enjoy how you talk about accessibility, because often we think in terms of accessibility about in very literal terms, does someone have a laptop? It's of course that's very important for accessibility, but also accessibility is discoverability, right? And changing these perspectives into centralizing different experiences. I think eventually is going to change how people use these digital objects, and then is going to change how we think, about the Middle Ages. I'd like to circle back a little bit to go to Astrid, because when we're thinking about digitization, and we also spoke about this a little bit in the last session, which I'm not sure whether you followed or not, but you have. Okay, so talking about this kind of idea of having a standard digitization or more kind of detailed digitization, kind of what can you as digitizer add? And how does that relate to the amount of labor that comes with that?
I love that question. I really enjoyed the previous session. I think there are standards. I mentioned going rogue in another scenario where I had my hands in the object. That does not adhere to standards. But that's where I say, what are these standards? And if the standard is trying to help us meet some kind of truth or some kind of accuracy. That's a very challenging word in digitization, because accurate to what? What is it accurate to? Color accuracy, light accuracy, how are the shadows, that kind of thing, yes. But are you accomplishing representing this object in a way that is meaningful and gives it its due, I think, importance? So we're starting to do that more and more with kind of interpretive object shots. That might be kind of a jaunty angle where you see, I'm looking at an object, I see that it has a stunning foredge. I go in and I take some extra shots. Currently, these might sit at the end of the file set because they're not standardized shots. They're extra things I'm adding, often without permission, because I think they have to be there. I recently presented a little project that I did where I made an artist book. I make art books, and I decided to ask our lead photographer to digitize it. I also asked some of our newer staff in the lab to digitize it, and I digitized it myself. So now I had these 3 versions of the same physical object in a digital state, where I was able to compare how they were different, how they were similar, and what things I sort of thought I agreed with, or I would do differently. One thing that stood out was the staff included a piece of wax paper that I stuck in the box, and it was like the second shot. So of course, when I saw it, I'm like, oh God. Normally as a production coordinator, I would have said, take that out of the box. But that was part of the experiment, see how this happens. So just going back to the question, I think that my answer would be, you should get creative. You see the object, and as humans, we have experiential interaction with the object, and that is what I want to bring, as well as the content, the textual data, the actual perhaps function of the object for why it was created. I want to present you with the materiality, the phenomenological attributes as best I can. And I think that's an ongoing process that I keep trying to refine, and I talk to others and find out what they're doing too.
Does anyone have anything to add? Speakers? Okay.
May I just hark back to this very point? Because I was wondering when I was listening to you, Astrid, and I find that very fascinating. And I was thinking about, kind of a childhood experience. So I grew up in Bamberg, and you might have seen photographs of the early 20th century of the Bamberg Cavalier. So this monumental statue inside the Bamberg Cathedral, which have actually become iconic in different sets of lighting. And I was wondering when I listened to you, is there any specificity or kind of a really new problem, systematically new problem, when we're going into the world of digitization compared with what has been done with the introduction of photography for the reproduction of artwork, like, for example? Because it really, that was a striking moment for me when you just described your experience there.
I love that. What a powerful connection. I can picture it. I'm going to have to look it up. I think, so certainly lighting and bringing in different scenarios of lighting is absolutely, and it's crucial, I think. I love the idea that we heard about in the previous session of this sort of digital cultural object. creating a hybrid where you're not only getting the direct standard object, but you're also getting additional information through various lighting, maybe RTI. Sometimes we just do weird things. We'll bring in aluminum foil and a flashlight or your phone light, and you're just making observations and realizing this brings out a highlight that we weren't getting before. So using creative approaches, and if you see something with your eye, you do your best to try to communicate that in the digital image. Might need to come back to me. Maybe someone else can weigh in on this, and I'll think it through a little further if I can think of a better example.
I can weigh in for a small comment. Is that I'm thinking that the questions that we're asking are also questions that were asked at the beginning of the 20th century. Yes, definitely. There's been written so much in the early, even about the Bamberger Ritter, which is like the whole facsimile strijd story, which is super interesting, with Panofsky. Yeah, although yeah. And of Wilflin, sorry, all these people come into my head now suddenly. But I'm thinking they, it's the same questions, but with we have I like to think we have a different view on things, or at least, yeah. Astrid.
Okay, now your speaking prompted me to come up with some more thoughts, which so I think there's a growing interest in, I don't know what to call it, like a historiography of digitization, where we're now looking at ways that things were imaged previously and thinking about how they were done versus how we do them now. Sometimes people ask about whether or not we want to have our names attributed to the digitization of certain things. And sure, the ones that look great, put my name on there. But if you go back to the ones from, I've been at Stanford 14 years doing this. Some of the first ones, we don't do it like that anymore. They look awful. So don't put my name on that one. But I think there should be a way to capture both of these. And currently, a lot of times, what our system does, it overwrites the old version when we image something a second time. I think that's a problem. I think you should be able to see, here's the old version, here's how it was done. Toggle through, here's the new version. What can we learn from how the approach has changed over the years? What have we lost? What have we gained? So I think versioning and being able to even maybe pre and post treatment shots from conservation, I'd love to see these integrated into the digital record so that you just have an abundance of digital data and observations available.
Yes, Dot, please.
Yeah, I just want to mention it's not only the difference in technology over time, which I think is really important, but it's also the imaging of objects over time, because objects change. I mean, you mentioned conservation techniques, but even beyond that, Bill Endres, who I mentioned already because of his 3D imaging, he's done work on the same manuscripts comparing images from an earlier print facsimile and his own images, and I think a few in between. And even though the manuscript has been very well cared for, like clearly ink is coming off, right? There are places where this has happened, and even where there's no, I think, record, but ink has been somebody has like reorganized ink to sort of cover up places, which is really interesting to see if you're studying, and this is only over 100 years. So all of these things are really important sort of aspects of the history of it.
Yes, I was also thinking of Bill's historic image gallery. Bridget, do you have anything to say to this?
Just that I think my fellow panelists are making great points about versioning, about it's a tension, right? Like, are we creating access points that we want to stand outside of history and not have their own history, or are we seeing these as an extension of the histories of individual books? If we're just creating access points, then you're just putting in a new doorway and you can destroy the old one. But if we're really committed to the idea that digital manuscripts are distinct from their analog exemplars and they are their own objects, then we need to understand when we're updating them out of existence, we're erasing what Astrid, I love this phrase, the historiography of digitization. We're erasing these objects' own histories. That's sort of the idealistic humanist side. Practical library side of things, there is a finite amount of space in the world. Digital objects maybe change the economic footprint of some researchers needing to travel the way that we might otherwise have needed to. But servers are not without an environmental impact. So I think it's always a tension between like, I want to, as a researcher, I want to hoard and save everything, but I'm also curious about what, Astrid and Dot, especially because you know more about this than I do, about the practicalities of digital conservation, about how we ought to pick and choose what can be saved, and whether there's some virtue in digital weeding and getting rid of some records and keeping others.
Can I just to tag on a tiny? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, this might be me talking. A tiny thought there is I think sometimes in digitization, maybe this is just a generalization, there's almost like an embarrassment, like we don't want to show the bad work, or and I think that is a little bit misguided, because it, like everything, it's a ongoing process. It's a iterative updating of technology, gaining of insight into how we do this, gaining understanding. I'm so grateful to be here today because I'm learning from all of you what you're looking for in the digital object. And I think it's so important to be aware of that. And that too will influence the images. So why not show the evolution of how we go about this work? Be proud that we're changing over the years.
Yeah, to address Bridget's question a little bit more too about weeding and what we keep and what we save. I mean, this is a huge issue, and it sort of goes beyond us. On one hand, storage space gets cheaper, is still like getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So on one hand, it's probably a thing that we'll just keep saving until we hit a point. There are much larger sort of, there's ecological questions about how much, damage to the environment all of this digital stuff is doing anyway. And I only want to mention it. I don't even want to get into that because it's like so far beyond my pay grade, and I almost don't think about it because it's such a huge issue. But like that's underlying everything that we're doing. So on in a position of like being in a library, we, I think we try to be thoughtful about what we save and how we save it at Penn. But, we haven't really had to, but that's, that is a great question. But I think whether or not Astrid saves her, 10-year-old images of this one manuscript that wasn't done particularly well last time, like that's not going to save the world. That's not going to make a difference. But it is worth mentioning that this is like an issue.
Well, I'd like to take up to Astrid Smith, because you said it would have been not very up to standards if one sees the fingers and hands of the one who's doing the digitalization. But I guess if one stops deceiving oneself that digital images objectives just because they are made from machines, that is quite an artisan work you're doing there, because you build your own little machine so you can tuck the bundles away and so on. And actually, if it's artisan work, one should see the fingerprints, and so they can become part of the history of knowledge one day, can't they?
Thank you for that. I love that comment. And I agree. I mentioned previously the artist book that I made and digitized. I did leave my hand in there. I think Bridget has talked a lot about the sort of accidental hands that appear in mass digitization shots. And sometimes I wonder too, like, was that an accident? I don't know. That's a great point. And I feel empowered to use it more often because you're right. It is a very artisan work. And I love being able to occasionally, I promise not to misuse it, but when necessary, if something can be accomplished better with hands. And the thing I try to think of is not to be distracting. So if the hand is actually distracting, I have a lot of tools. I've made a lot of tools to aid with opening things like my talk, actually. That's right. So I think I carefully weigh, is this best accomplished with a tool? Do I want to leave my hands in? But I think you're right. Maybe more often I can err on the side of visibility.
We'd love to see your hands, Astrid. Is there, we're nearing the end of the session. Is there someone who would like to have the honor to have the last question? Okay, well, I still have many questions, but I will leave you with maybe a question that we're not going to answer in the last 5 minutes. Again, because this is something that I've been thinking about a little bit, and especially Dot, when you were talking about the facsimiles and how you want to present these medieval manuscripts to an audience that doesn't necessarily gets to see them or don't know what it's like to be in a room with them, as you said. I think at the very beginning of this session, this is going to be my tantalizing question. Why do we actually digitize these manuscripts? And is it actually kind of useful to think about digitization in terms of a perfect recreation of the object when we're bringing it to maybe a larger audience who don't necessarily know what it's like to work with manuscripts? Because this experience is the experience of the digital is different than the experience of the manuscript. So yeah, the question is why.
Well, actually, because we care for them and don't want to open them too often, I think. So I can do lots of work before I visit the library and look at the thing itself, yeah. And it's good for the book that I do much of my work at home.
Yeah. So in terms of preservation, it works. Yeah, Bridget, please.
I'm thinking here of this wonderful presentation that Joanna Green gave in May of 2018, where she started by talking about her experience looking at the Lindisfarne Gospels digitized on CD-ROM and getting to kind of hear this weird computery crackle, highly performative, as she turned the pages, and how that kind of opened up the world of manuscript studies and book history to her, especially as somebody who grew up very near Lindisfarne, and it made her feel like this was her world too. And I think that's the answer I would give. She never got a chance to publish that work, but that's the thing I think of a lot when I think about why more broadly do we digitize. I think it creates the opportunity for projects like mine to piggyback on what other people have made. But I think a lot about people like Joanna looking at digital objects and thinking, hey, I could do that. I could do that. I could touch that. That could be my job. And I think that's really powerful, to open it up to beyond the usual suspects.
Astrid.
I love that. I can picture it. So the why, I sit in meetings much of my day talking about the why, because that is how the work is funded. And that is how the work comes to the lab, is subject specialists present an idea for a project, and they have to say why. Why is this important? Why should this happen instead of this other project? And we look at all the projects. We have a really long backlog, and we choose carefully what different types of materials we can image at any given time in the lab. The why is also going to drive very small decisions, like heaven forbid you not capture the blanks. But that is a question that the curator gets to weigh in on. Is this important to my project? Sometimes it's no, even against strong advising to include every aspect of the digital. But I think also, excuse me, the why is important because we don't have unlimited resources. We can't do every single project. And the why is, on a smaller scale, goes into project documentation that I give my staff. Why am I asking them to do this a certain way? Well, it relates back to the curatorial desire. Why are we not taking out staples? Why are we unfolding something to image inside of it? These tiny choices all relate back to the overarching principle of the project.
Thank you. I was thinking, sorry, about Bridget's answer as well, and I actually wrote down in my notes when I was preparing that always here is a great reason why. It's a beautiful answer to why, but actually I'm thinking I love the fact that you brought up Joanna's work here, and she has made a very big and important contribution to our field. So it's good to maybe as an ending stand still for a little bit and think of her. Yeah. Okay. As that's the ending of this session. I'm sorry to making it a little bit emotional for some people. And I would very much like to thank our speakers, all of them coming from very far away. Hopefully at some point we'll all be in the same room together, but now virtually we are. Okay.
Thank you so much.